On the 12th of July 1872, a workhouse clerk in County Durham wrote down one sentence about a boy who was no bother to his stepmother. The record calls her a widow, insured, respectable, unlucky, 3 times over. 21 bodies later, nobody had ever called her anything else. This is 10 most disturbing female serial killers Britain has ever produced. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton stood in the doorway of her cottage in West Auckland in July 1872 and told a parish official that her 7-year-old stepson was in her way. His name was Charles Edward Cotton. The official, Thomas Riley, had come to ask her to help nurse a woman in the village who was sick with smallpox. Mary Ann said she couldn't do it while the boy was underfoot. She asked if he could be sent to the workhouse. Riley told her that wasn't how it worked. She would have to go with him. Before she walked away, she said something Riley never forgot. She said the boy was sickly and added, "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cottons." 5 days later, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. He was the last of at least 21 people who died around Mary Ann Cotton over roughly 20 years, including 3 husbands, a lover, her own mother, and most of her 13 children. She used arsenic, and she collected insurance money almost every time. By the time anyone in County Durham worked out what she had been doing, most of the bodies had already been buried in half a dozen different towns for years. Mary Ann Robson was born on the 31st of October 1832 in Low Morsley, a small mining village on the outskirts of Hetton-le-Hole, and baptised less than 2 weeks later at St Mary's Church in West Rainton. Her father, Michael Robson, worked as a miner and was, by most accounts, a strict and deeply religious man. When Mary Ann was around 8 years old, the family moved to the nearby village of Merton, where she struggled to settle into a new school and make friends. Not long after that move, her father fell roughly 150 feet to his death down a mine shaft at Merton Colliery, leaving Mary Ann and her mother in poverty. Her mother remarried a man named George Stott a couple of years later, and Mary Ann never got along with her new stepfather. At 16, she left home to work as a nurse in the household of a man named Edward Potter in the nearby village of South Hetton. After 3 years in that role, she returned to her mother's house and retrained as a dressmaker. People who studied her life later said, this early hardship shaped her badly. She grew up wanting money and status, and she grew up watching how little a working family had left over if the main earner suddenly died. In 1852, at the age of 20, she married her first husband, William Mowbray, a colliery labourer, at a register office in Newcastle upon Tyne. The two of them moved south to the area around Plymouth, Devon, and into neighbouring Cornwall, where William found work on the railway as it expanded across the county. While they lived there, Mary Ann gave birth to somewhere between 4 and 5 children, by her own uncertain later account, and all but one died within their first year of life. Every death was recorded the same way, as gastric fever, a diagnosis common enough at the time to raise no alarm on its own. The family eventually returned north to County Durham, where William took work first as a foreman at South Hetton Colliery and later as a fireman aboard a steam vessel sailing out of Sunderland, work that kept him away from home for long stretches. 2 more daughters were born during this period, Isabella in 1858 and a girl named Margaret Jane, who died of scarlet fever in 1860. A second daughter, also named Margaret Jane, was born the following year, and a son, John Robert William, was born in 1863 but died the next year of gastric fever. William himself died of an intestinal disorder in January 1865. The British and Prudential Insurance Office paid Mary Ann £35 on William's policy, a meaningful sum of money for a working-class widow at the time, worth several £1,000s today, along with a smaller payout of £2 5 shillings on their son John's policy. Of the 5 or 6 children she had brought into the world during her marriage to Mowbray, only one, her daughter Isabella, was still alive by the time William died, and Mary Ann sent the girl to live with her own mother rather than raise her herself. She did not stay single long. She returned to Sunderland and took a position at Sunderland Infirmary, an institution that treated contagious fever alongside its regular dispensary work, giving her steady access to medicine cabinets and to a fresh supply of vulnerable patients. One of those patients was an engineer named George Ward, who was recovering from an illness under her care. They married at St. Peter's Church in Monkwearmouth on the 28th of August 1865. Ward's health, which had seemed to improve, went into a long decline marked by paralysis and intestinal problems, and he died on the 20th of October 1866, just over a year into the marriage. His death certificate gave the cause as English cholera and typhoid, two entirely different illnesses listed together, which says as much about the state of Victorian diagnosis as it does about what was actually happening inside George Ward's body. The doctor who had attended him later admitted in court that although Ward had clearly been very ill, he had still been surprised at how suddenly the end came. Mary Ann collected on his insurance as well. Soon after, she answered an advertisement for a housekeeper placed by James Robinson, a shipwright working in the Pallion area of Sunderland, whose wife, Hannah, had recently died and left him with several young children to manage alone. Mary Ann moved into the Robinson household in late December 1866. Within about a week, Robinson's 10-month-old son from his marriage to Hannah died of gastric fever. Around the same time, in the first half of 1867, two more of Robinson's children also died, along with Isabella, Mary Ann's own surviving daughter, from her marriage to William Mowbray. It was also during this stretch that Mary Ann's mother, living in Seaham Harbour and still acting as Isabella's guardian before the girl's death, fell ill. Mary Ann went to nurse her. Her mother appeared to be recovering at first, but the recovery gave way to severe stomach pains, and she died only 9 days after Mary Ann's visit began. Even by the harsh standards of infant and childhood mortality in Victorian Britain, the sheer concentration of death surrounding one household in such a short window was, as later observers put it, well beyond anything that could be called ordinary. Robinson married Mary Ann on the 11th of August 1867 at St. Michael's Church in Bishop Wearmouth. Their first child together, a daughter named Margaret Isabella, was born that November and died the following February. A second child, a son named George, was born on the 18th of June 1869 and survived. By this point, though, Robinson had grown deeply suspicious of his new wife, particularly her constant pressure on him to take out a life insurance policy on himself, something he steadily refused to do. He eventually discovered that she had run up roughly £60 in secret debts, had taken more than £50 from funds he'd expected her to bank on his behalf, and had been quietly pressuring his older children into pawning household valuables behind his back. He threw her out of the house and kept custody of their surviving son, George. James Robinson would turn out to be the only husband of Mary Ann Cotton's who outlived her. After Robinson evicted her, Mary Ann drifted for a while, reportedly living on the streets at points, before reconnecting with an old friend, Margaret Cotton, who told her about her brother, Frederick Cotton, a recently widowed pitman living in Walbottle, Northumberland, who had already lost 2 of his 4 children. Mary Ann pursued him. Margaret Cotton, the friend who had introduced them and who was living in the same household at the time, died soon after Mary Ann arrived, suffering the same severe stomach pains that had preceded so many of the other deaths around her. Mary Ann married Frederick Cotton on the 17th of September 1870 at a church in Monkwearmouth. She was already pregnant by him. It did not matter to her that she was still technically married to James Robinson, since no divorce had ever been filed. It was a bigamous marriage, and Frederick likely never knew. The new family settled in West Auckland, a small County Durham village, in the summer of 1871, moving into a house on Johnson Terrace. Frederick had 2 young sons from his first marriage, Frederick Jr. and Charles Edward. Mary Ann took out life insurance policies on her new husband, and both boys through the same British and Prudential insurance company she had used before. It was around this time that Mary Ann learned an old flame of hers, a man named Joseph Nattrass, was living close by in West Auckland and was no longer married. She encouraged the move to that specific village herself. Frederick Cotton fell ill not long after they arrived and died in September 1871 after roughly 2 weeks of illness. Mary Ann was now a widow again, this time with 2 stepsons and her own infant son, Robert Robson Cotton, to look after, and she began collecting relief payments for the boys who weren't biologically hers. Joseph Nattrass moved in as a lodger not long after Frederick's death, and their affair picked back up exactly where it had left off years earlier. Nattrass changed his will in Mary Ann's favour. At the same time, Mary Ann took a job nursing a local excise officer who was recovering from smallpox, a man most sources identify only by the surname Quick Manning. She became pregnant by him too. Now she had a lover living in her house, a new man she wanted to marry, and 3 children standing in the way of the life she wanted to build. Within a matter of weeks, in the spring of 1872, all 3 obstacles started dying, one after another. Her infant son Robert died first. Then her stepson Frederick Cotton Jr. died. Then Joseph Nattrass, the lodger and lover who had just rewritten his will to leave her money, died too. Mary Ann collected roughly £30 from Nattrass's estate. That left only one obstacle standing between Mary Ann Cotton and the life she wanted. Her surviving stepson, 7-year-old Charles Edward Cotton. On the 6th of July, 1872, Mary Ann tried to have Charles sent to the workhouse on his own. The workhouse refused to take him without her. 6 days later, on the 12th of July, he was dead. Witnesses said the boy had appeared completely healthy less than a week before he died. The illness followed the same pattern as all the others: sudden stomach pain, vomiting, and a rapid decline. Mary Ann did not go to a doctor first when Charles died. She went to the insurance office to ask for her payout. There, she learned that no money would be released until a death certificate had been issued. That single detail, an insurance clerk explaining paperwork to a grieving stepmother who hadn't even been to see a doctor yet, was the small crack that broke the whole case open. Thomas Riley, the parish official Mary Ann had spoken to just days before Charles's death, had not forgotten her strange comment about the boy being no trouble for much longer. When Charles died so soon afterward, Riley went straight to the local police and to the doctor, a man named William Byers Kilburn, who had treated Charles in his final days. Riley asked the doctor to delay writing the death certificate until questions could be answered. Dr. Kilburn agreed, and rather than dispose of everything, he quietly kept samples from the boy's stomach. When those samples were tested, they came back positive for arsenic. Word spread through the small village fast. Local newspapers picked up the story within days, and reporters started digging into Mary Ann Cotton's past on their own. What they found stunned them. She had lived across several different counties in northern England over the previous 2 decades, and in every single place she had lived, people around her had died of the exact same symptoms. 3 husbands, a lover, her own mother, 10 or 11 children. All of them gone, all recorded as gastric fever, all clustered around one woman. Police arrested Mary Ann Cotton on the 18th of July, 1872, charging her with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton. She said almost nothing in response. Investigators exhumed the bodies of Joseph Nattrass, Frederick Cotton Jr., and baby Robert Robson Cotton. All 3 tested positive for arsenic. At this point, Mary Ann was roughly 7 months pregnant with her 13th child, the daughter of the excise officer Quick Manning, who had already distanced himself from her and, according to some accounts, changed his name and left the area rather than be connected to the scandal. Because of the pregnancy, authorities delayed her trial until after the baby was born. She gave birth inside Durham Gaol on the 7th of January, 1873, to a daughter she named Margaret Edith Quick Manning Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton's trial opened at Durham Assizes on the 5th of March, 1873, in front of Justice Archibald. She was formally charged only with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, since prosecutors focused their strongest, most provable case on a single victim rather than trying to prosecute every suspected death at once. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense lawyer, Thomas Campbell Foster, argued that Charles had not been poisoned deliberately at all. He claimed the boy had accidentally inhaled arsenic dust that came from the green floral wallpaper in their home, since arsenic-based dye was genuinely used in some wallpaper at the time. It wasn't a made-up defense out of nowhere. Arsenic really was common in Victorian households, in dyes, in medicines, even in children's toys. But the prosecution, led by Sir Charles Russell, tore the defense apart. Russell pointed out that at least 10 of the people connected to Mary Ann's suspicious deaths had never even set foot in the room where the supposedly poisoned wallpaper hung. He also brought a chemist's assistant, Thomas Detchon, to the stand, who testified that he remembered a woman matching Mary Ann's description coming into the shop years earlier and purchasing arsenic along with soft soap, a combination sometimes used at the time to try to mask the taste. The jury took a little over an hour to reach their decision. Guilty of willful murder, Justice Archibald sentenced her to death, telling her to seek forgiveness from God because there was no earthly mercy left for her to receive. Mary Ann Cotton never confessed to any of the killings, not to Charles, not to any of the others suspected around her. She maintained her innocence all the way to the gallows. Local people, meanwhile, had already made up their minds about her. A children's rhyme began circulating in the area not long after her arrest, one that working-class families in County Durham would go on to sing for generations. Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and forgotten. She lies in a grave with her bones all rotten. Mary Ann Cotton was hanged at Durham Gaol on the 24th of March 1873. The execution did not go cleanly. The rope had been set too short, whether by mistake or by design, nobody has ever confirmed, and instead of breaking her neck instantly, the drop left her strangling instead. It took roughly 3 minutes for her to die, with the executioner reportedly having to press down on her shoulders to finish the job. Following standard practice for executed prisoners of the era, she was buried in an unmarked grave within the grounds of Durham Gaol itself, with no headstone left behind to mark exactly where. Of the 13 children she is believed to have given birth to across her lifetime, only 2 outlived her: her son George, who remained in James Robinson's custody, and her infant daughter, Margaret Edith, born in the Gaol just weeks before the trial, who went on to live a full life until 1954, more than 80 years after her mother's execution. She was one of the earliest cases where a British jury faced overwhelming physical evidence, a documented pattern of deaths, and a clear financial motive, all in a single defendant, and she is now widely considered Britain's first documented female serial killer, years before that term ever existed in the English language. 21 people connected to her died over a 20-year period, in Devon, Cornwall, Sunderland and West Auckland alike, spread out just enough and explained away by ordinary-sounding illness just convincingly enough that no single town ever caught the pattern on its own. It took newspapers doing what the authorities in each separate parish had failed to do, put the whole map together, before anyone realized how many graves actually led back to the same woman. Her case has stayed in public memory ever since, the subject of a biography by criminologist David Wilson, a 2016 ITV drama called Dark Angel, starring Joanne Froggatt in the lead role, and an episode of the BBC podcast series Lucy Worsley's Lady Killers. A teapot that once belonged to her still sits on display today at Beamish, the open-air museum of the north of England, a small, ordinary household object that has outlasted every single person who ever sat down to a meal in Mary Ann Cotton's kitchen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mary Ann Cotton built her body count slowly, one household and one insurance policy at a time, hiding in plain sight across county lines. The next woman on this list didn't need husbands or insurance forms to get away with murder for years. She used something far more disturbing, the trust that desperate mothers placed in a stranger's advertisement in the newspaper. Amelia Dyer, a bargeman working the River Thames near Reading, pulled a small brown paper parcel out of the water on the 30th of March, 1896. It was weighed down with a brick. Inside was the body of a baby girl. A length of white tape had been knotted tightly around her tiny throat. That single parcel would eventually be linked to Amelia Dyer, a 57-year-old woman working under the name Mrs. Thomas, who had spent close to 3 decades taking in other people's babies for a fee and then killing most of them. Only one murder was ever formally proven against her in court, but the number of infants who likely died at her hands over her long career is estimated by historians anywhere from a dozen confirmed cases into the hundreds, which would make her one of the most prolific serial killers Britain has ever produced, male or female. Amelia Elizabeth Hobley was born in 1837 in the village of Pile Marsh, near Bristol, the youngest of 5 children born to a master shoemaker named Samuel Hobley and his wife Sarah. Unusually for a working-class girl of her time, Amelia stayed in school into her teenage years and could read and write well. Her childhood was overshadowed by her mother's mental collapse, which family accounts link to a bout of typhus, and Amelia grew up watching her mother's decline before her mother eventually died. As a young woman, Amelia trained as a nurse, a respectable trade that would later give her the exact skills and credibility she needed to run her deadly operation. In 1861, she married George Thomas, a brewer's assistant more than 30 years older than her. The couple had one daughter, Ellen. When George died in 1869, Amelia was left a widow with a young child and no steady income, and it was around this time that another woman in her circle, a midwife named Ellen Danes, introduced her to a trade that was disturbingly common in Victorian England: baby farming. Baby farming worked like this. An unmarried woman who had a child out of wedlock faced total social ruin if anyone found out. She could lose her job, her housing, and her standing in her community in an instant. Women in that position needed somewhere to place their baby, quietly and permanently, so they could keep working and keep their secret. Baby farmers like Amelia advertised in local newspapers, offering to adopt or nurse a child in exchange for an upfront fee, sometimes alongside a parcel of baby clothes. Amelia's letters to worried mothers were warm and convincing. She described herself as a happily married, respectable woman who simply wanted a child for company, not for money. Desperate mothers, usually domestic servants or factory workers with no other options, paid her anywhere from £10 to £80, a substantial sum at the time, worth anywhere from roughly £1,000 to £8,000 today. Some of these babies really were cared for, at least for a while. Many others died of neglect within days or weeks, malnourished and ignored until nature did the work for her. And some, especially later in her career, she killed herself, deliberately and quickly. Amelia's first brush with the law came in 1879, when a doctor in her care grew suspicious after 4 infants died in her household within 2 weeks of each other. Authorities wanted to charge her with manslaughter, but they couldn't build a strong enough case, so she was convicted only of criminal neglect and sentenced to 6 months of hard labor, the maximum the court could give her for that lesser charge. It was a narrow escape, and it taught her an important lesson about how easily suspicion could be raised and how weak the child protection laws of the time actually were. After her release, she went back to nursing for a while and also learned a trick that would serve her for years afterward. She began feigning insanity, drawing on the symptoms she remembered from watching her own mother's breakdown, and got herself admitted into asylums more than once. Inside those institutions, she found free food, a warm bed, and a convenient place to disappear from public view whenever suspicion around her started building in one town. By the 1890s, Amelia was in her mid-50s and had spent close to 3 decades moving between Bristol, Cardiff, Plymouth, Liverpool, London, and finally Reading, staying just ahead of grieving mothers and suspicious neighbours by constantly relocating and constantly changing her name. She operated under aliases, including Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Scott, and Mrs. Stansfield, so that no single town or police force ever connected all the deaths back to one woman. In 1893, she was discharged from Wells Asylum, and by 1895, she had relocated to Caversham in Berkshire, moving in with her adult daughter Mary, known as Polly, and Polly's husband, Arthur Palmer. Later that year, she moved again to a house on Kensington Road in Reading. This was the household where her final and most carefully documented murders took place. In January 1896, Amelia placed a newspaper advertisement offering to adopt a baby for a modest fee, describing herself, falsely, as a happily married woman longing for a child of her own. A 23-year-old barmaid named Evelina Marmon answered the ad. Evelina had given birth to a daughter, Doris, out of wedlock, and like so many women before her, she could not keep her job and raise a baby at the same time. Amelia's reply was warm and reassuring, describing herself and her husband as plain, homely people who wanted a baby for company rather than for money. Evelina handed her infant daughter over to Amelia at Gloucester railway station and never saw her alive again. Around the same time, Amelia also agreed to take in another infant, a girl named Helena Fry, from a different desperate mother who had answered a similar advertisement. What happened next unfolded with cold, mechanical speed. Sometime in late March 1896, Amelia strangled baby Helena Fry using a length of white dressmaking edging tape, wound around the infant's neck and knotted tight. She wrapped the small body in brown paper and dropped the parcel into the River Thames, weighting it down with a brick so it would sink rather than float. It did not stay hidden. On the 30th of March, the bargeman's discovery brought the parcel back to the surface, and with it, the beginning of the end for Amelia Dyer. Just 2 days later, on the 1st of April, Amelia took delivery of baby Doris Marmon at her Reading home. She strangled the 4-month-old with the same white edging tape almost immediately. The following day, a 13-month-old boy named Harry Simmons was also brought to the house. By this point, Amelia had run out of spare tape, so according to later evidence, she removed the tape from around dead baby Doris's neck and reused it to strangle Harry as well. On the 2nd of April, she packed both small bodies into a single carpet bag and threw it off a dock into the Thames. Detective Constable James Anderson, of the Reading Police, had been assigned to trace the origin of the parcel containing Helena Fry's body almost as soon as it was pulled from the river. A faint, partially smudged address on the wrapping paper eventually led investigators back to a woman using the name Mrs. Thomas. Rather than making an immediate arrest, police set up a sting operation, using a young decoy posing as a mother willing to pay Amelia to take in a child. Amelia agreed to the arrangement and travelled to meet her supposed new client on the 3rd and 4th of April. Instead of collecting a baby and a fee, she was arrested and charged with murder. When officers searched her home on Kensington Road, the smell of decomposition hit them before they even finished stepping through the door. Inside, they found piles of unused baby clothing that infant customers had sent along with their payments, pawn tickets for children's belongings she had sold off for extra cash, stacks of newspaper advertisement receipts from towns across the country, and a supply of white edging tape identical to what had been found around Helena Fry's neck. Word spread quickly, and the Thames was dragged in the days that followed. Investigators recovered the bodies of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons, still tangled together in the same carpet bag Amelia had used to dispose of them. 2 more small bodies surfaced afterward, another boy and another girl, bringing the confirmed total pulled from the river to at least 6 infants, all bound with the same kind of tape. Detectives learned that in just the few months before her arrest, roughly 20 separate children had passed through Amelia's care, and almost none of them could be accounted for as living, healthy babies handed over to new families. Amelia's daughter Polly and Polly's husband Arthur Palmer were initially charged as accessories, since the killings had taken place inside the same house where they lived. Amelia, in a written confession from her prison cell, insisted that neither her daughter nor her son-in-law had any knowledge of what she had done. Charges against Arthur Palmer were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. Polly, desperate to save herself, testified against her own mother at trial and claimed she had never suspected a thing, even though the killings had happened inside her own house within a day of one another. Amelia Dyer's trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of May 1896. Prosecutors focused the case on a single, provable charge, the murder of baby Doris Marmon, rather than trying to prove every suspected death at once. Amelia's defense rested entirely on an insanity plea. Her lawyers pointed to her mother's documented mental collapse, her own repeated stays in asylums over the years, and argued she was not fully responsible for her actions. It was a calculated gamble, built on a pattern she had used successfully before to dodge serious punishment. This time it failed completely. Of the 3 doctors who examined her for the court, 2 concluded she was not actually mentally unsound, and prosecutors argued convincingly that her past hospital stays had been deliberate performances, not genuine breakdowns, designed to buy her safety whenever suspicion closed in. Amelia had also spent her time in custody singing hymns, carrying a hymn book into the courtroom, and speaking often of being forgiven by God, behavior her lawyers pointed to as proof of instability and which the prosecution dismissed as calculated theatre. The jury did not need long to decide. They deliberated for roughly 4.5 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. Amelia was sentenced to death. In the 3 weeks she spent in the condemned cell awaiting execution, she filled 5 separate notebooks with what she called her last true and only confession, admitting in detail to far more killings than the single one she had been convicted of. She told authorities plainly how to identify her victims among the many infant bodies pulled from rivers over the years, saying investigators would know her babies by the tape tied around their necks. She continued to insist that her daughter Polly had never known what was happening under her own roof, writing in one letter dated the 5th of June that she was glad to see Polly looking well and grieved that her daughter was suffering for something that was not her fault. Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison on the morning of the 10th of June 1896 by executioner James Billington. When asked on the scaffold if she had any final words, she said only, "I have nothing to say." She was 57 years old. Her daughter Polly stood trial separately not long after and was ultimately cleared, walking away from the case that had exposed her own mother as one of the most prolific child killers in British history. Investigators at the time attributed at least a dozen deaths to Amelia, with real confidence, based on physical evidence and her own written confession. But the true number will never be fully known, since she had operated for close to 3 decades across 5 different cities under at least 4 different false names, and record-keeping around unwanted infants at the time was almost non-existent. Some historians researching the full span of her career have suggested the real total could run into the hundreds, though that figure cannot be confirmed and should be treated as an estimate rather than a fact. Amelia Dyer's case did produce one lasting outcome that outlived her by decades. Her trial exposed just how easy it had been for a woman to advertise for babies, take payment, and make children disappear with almost no oversight from the state at any point in the process. In the years that followed her execution, Parliament passed the Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 and later the Children Act of 1908, laws that required any change of custody or death of a child under 7 to be reported to local authorities within 48 hours, and that placed real licensing and inspection requirements on anyone caring for other people's infants. Baby farming as an unregulated trade effectively died with the case that made Amelia Dyer infamous, even though nobody could ever put a final, certain number on how many children died before the law finally caught up with her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Amelia Dyer built her killing around the desperation of mothers who had nowhere else to turn and a legal system with almost no way to check on a stranger's promises. The next woman on this list needed no advertisement and no desperate stranger's trust at all. She had something far more effective: a boyfriend with a car, a taste for cruelty, and 5 children from her own neighborhood who thought they could trust her. Myra Hindley. On the night of the 6th of October, 1965, a 23-year-old man named David Smith stood outside a small house at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley, Greater Manchester, waiting for a signal. His sister-in-law, Myra Hindley, had told him to wait for a flashing light before knocking on the door. When the light came, Smith knocked, and Hindley's boyfriend, Ian Brady, opened the door and told him he'd come to collect some miniature wine bottles. Smith stepped into the kitchen. A minute or two later, he heard a scream, so loud and high-pitched he barely recognized it as human. He heard Hindley shouting, "Dave, help him!" When Smith ran into the living room, he saw a teenage boy lying with his head and shoulders on the couch, legs on the floor, and Brady standing over him holding an axe. That boy was 17-year-old Edward Evans. He was the 5th and final victim of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, the couple who would go on to become known across Britain as the Moors murderers. Between July 1963 and October 1965, Hindley and Brady abducted, tortured and killed 5 children and teenagers in and around Manchester, burying most of their victims in shallow graves on Saddleworth Moor. Myra Hindley was born on the 23rd of July 1942 in Crumpsall, Manchester, to Bob and Nellie Hindley. She grew up in Gorton, a poor, working-class area of the city filled with run-down Victorian housing. Her father was an alcoholic who was frequently violent toward his wife and children, and the family home was so cramped that Myra had to sleep in a single bed pushed right up against her parents' double bed. As a young woman, she worked as a typist and left school with no particular trouble in her record, nothing that suggested what she would later become part of. Ian Brady's early life was, if anything, even more unstable. He was born Ian Duncan Stewart in Glasgow in 1938, the illegitimate son of a young tea-room waitress named Maggie Stewart, who could not afford to raise him, and placed him with a local family, the Sloanes, while he was still an infant. She visited less and less as he grew older. When Brady was around 12, his mother moved to Manchester with her new husband, Patrick Brady, and Ian took his stepfather's surname. As a child, Brady had already shown signs of real cruelty, torturing and killing animals, at one point setting a dog on fire, and later turning that same cruelty toward other children. He grew up reading about Nazi atrocities and became fascinated with the writings of the Marquis de Sade, the French author whose name gave us the word sadism. Hindley and Brady met in January 1961 at Millward's Merchandising, a wholesale chemical distribution company in Gorton, where Brady worked as a clerk and Hindley as a typist. Brady was quiet, punctual, and known among his co-workers as short-tempered, but Hindley found herself drawn to him almost immediately. Over the following months, Brady introduced her to his interests: Nazi literature, photographs of atrocities, and the philosophy of the Marquis de Sade, and Hindley, by her own later account, became devoted to him almost completely. What began as a workplace attraction slowly turned into something far darker, as Brady gradually shaped Hindley into a willing partner for what he had already been planning in his own mind for some time. By the time their relationship reached its second year, Brady had started testing exactly how far Hindley's loyalty to him would stretch, and what he was testing her for was murder. Their first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, taken on the 12th of July 1963. Hindley approached Pauline, whom she already knew from the neighborhood, and asked for her help finding a glove she claimed to have lost on Saddleworth Moor, offering her some records as a thank you if she'd come along. Once they reached the moor, Brady arrived separately on his motorcycle, and Hindley left Pauline in his company while she waited nearby. Brady raped Pauline and cut her throat, only returning to fetch Hindley afterward so the two of them could bury the body together. 4 months later, on the 23rd of November 1963, they abducted 12-year-old John Kilbride from a market in Ashton-under-Lyne. He was raped and then strangled, either with a piece of string or by hand. Accounts from Brady and Hindley over the years never fully agreed on which. On the 16th of June 1964, they abducted 12-year-old Keith Bennett on his way to his grandmother's house and killed him. His body has never been found, despite decades of searching on the moor that continue to this day. On Boxing Day, the 26th of December 1964, they went to a local fairground and lured 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey away by asking her to help carry some packages. They brought her back to their house, forced her to undress and pose for photographs, then raped and killed her while recording parts of the ordeal on audio tape. She was buried on the moor alongside the others. For more than 2 years, Hindley and Brady carried out these killings without drawing any serious suspicion toward themselves. They photographed the moor obsessively, treating it almost like a private map only they understood, and they brought along Hindley's 12-year-old niece on picnics to the same stretch of land more than once, all while knowing exactly what lay buried beneath it. It was only when Brady turned his violence towards someone who wasn't a stranger, but toward Hindley's own brother-in-law's household, that the pattern finally cracked open. After David Smith witnessed Edward Evans being killed with an axe, on the night of the 6th of October 1965, Brady and Hindley calmly cleaned up the scene and wrapped Evans's body in plastic sheeting, apparently planning to move it later that night. Smith went home in a state of shock, too frightened to say anything at first, worried that speaking up might make him the next target. The following morning, the 7th of October, he told his wife Maureen everything, and together they went straight to the police. Detectives arrived at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue and found Edward Evans's body wrapped in plastic in an upstairs bedroom, exactly as Smith had described. Hindley was questioned and initially backed up Brady's version of events, insisting she had been horrified and frightened by what she'd witnessed. She was not arrested immediately. It was only 4 days later, after police searched her car and found a 3-page document detailing, in explicit planning language, exactly how she and Brady intended to carry out Evans's murder, that she was formally charged as well. What turned this from a single, isolated killing into a far larger investigation was one detail David Smith had mentioned almost in passing. Brady had told him, during their friendship, that other bodies were buried on Saddleworth Moor. Officers already had a backlog of unexplained child disappearances from the surrounding area over the previous 2 years, and Smith's comment gave them, for the first time, a specific place to start looking. While searching Hindley's home, Police found a claim check ticket tucked inside the spine of her prayer book. That ticket led them to a set of suitcases left in storage at Manchester Central train station. Inside those cases were photographs Brady had taken on Saddleworth Moor, along with the audio tape recorded during Leslie Ann Downey's final hours. Investigators also found a notebook containing a name that matched one of the missing children. With this evidence in hand, police began systematically searching the moor. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 16th of October, 1965, officers were preparing to end their search for the day when a constable spotted a small fragment of white material sticking out of the ground, roughly 150 yards from the main road. It was a grave, and inside it, nearly 10 months after she vanished, was the body of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Her parents were brought in and shown her folded clothing before being taken to identify her body directly. Soon afterward, police also located the grave of John Kilbride nearby. Investigators searched extensively for the remains of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett as well, but at that stage they came up empty, and without physical bodies to confirm those two disappearances as murders, prosecutors could not yet bring charges connected to them. Hindley and Brady's trial opened on the 27th of April 1966 at Chester Assizes. Brady was charged with 3 murders, those of Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride, and pleaded not guilty to all 3. Hindley was charged with the murders of Evans and Downey, and pleaded not guilty to both, while facing a lesser charge of accessory to the murder of Kilbride, since the physical evidence tying her directly to his death was weaker than it was for the other 2 cases. The trial exposed the recovered tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey's final hours to the courtroom, a piece of evidence so disturbing that even hardened journalists covering the case struggled to describe it in print. The jury reached its verdicts after considering all the evidence laid out over the trial. Brady was found guilty on all 3 counts of murder. Hindley was found guilty of murdering Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey, and guilty as an accessory in the killing of John Kilbride. The judge, sentencing them, described the pair as sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. Because Britain had abolished the death penalty for murder only weeks before their arrest, the harshest sentence available to the court was life imprisonment rather than execution. Brady received 3 life sentences. Hindley received 2 life sentences for the murders, plus an additional 7 years for her role as an accessory in Kilbride's death. For roughly the next 20 years, Myra Hindley denied any involvement in the disappearances of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, even as she quietly worked to build support for her own release from prison. In 1970, she cut off all contact with Brady and began presenting herself publicly as a changed woman, someone who had been drawn into violence by a controlling partner rather than someone who had actively chosen it. She pursued education while in prison, gained support from some public figures who came to believe in her rehabilitation, and campaigned steadily for parole through the 1970s and 1980s, all while continuing to insist she had nothing to do with the 2 missing children whose bodies had never been found. That changed in 1985, when Brady, from within the psychiatric hospital where he was being held, confessed to killing both Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. Police reopened the investigation into both cases. Under mounting pressure and facing overwhelming new scrutiny, Hindley finally admitted her own full involvement in 1987, more than 2 decades after the killings themselves, confessing to her role in all 5 murders, rather than just the 2 she had originally been convicted of. Following the fresh confessions, investigators returned to Saddleworth Moor, with both Brady and Hindley separately taken out to help identify burial locations, though neither could pinpoint an exact spot with confidence after so many years. On the 1st of July 1987, searchers finally located the remains of Pauline Reed, identified in part by the distinctive party dress she had been wearing the night she disappeared back in 1963. Keith Bennett's body has never been recovered, despite repeated searches of the moor conducted over the decades since, including efforts that continued long after both Brady and Hindley were dead. His family spent the rest of their lives without a grave to visit or a confirmed resting place to grieve at. Hindley's campaign for release continued even after her full confession, and it consistently ran into the same wall of public and political resistance. In 1990, the Home Secretary at the time formally imposed a whole-life tariff on her sentence, meaning she would never become eligible for parole under any circumstance. She challenged this ruling repeatedly through the courts over the following decade. On the 30th of March 2000, a panel of 5 law lords rejected her final appeal for early release, ruling that her life sentence had to mean exactly that, life, given what the panel described as her exceptionally wicked and uniquely evil crimes. One of the presiding lords, Lord Steyne, stated plainly that even set against the entire sordid history of crimes against children in Britain, the murders committed jointly by Hindley and Brady stood apart as uniquely evil. Hindley's own mugshot, taken in the hours after her 1965 arrest, had by this point become one of the most recognizable images of a criminal in British history, reprinted so often across newspapers, books, and even controversial art exhibitions that some cultural critics described it as a modern symbol of feminine evil in the public imagination. Myra Hindley died in prison custody in November 2002 at the age of 60 from bronchial pneumonia, a condition worsened by years of declining health behind bars. She had spent 36 years in custody without ever being released, having gone from a 23-year-old typist infatuated with a violent boyfriend to one of the most reviled women in modern British history. Ian Brady remained in Ashworth High Security Psychiatric Hospital for the rest of his life and died there in 2017. Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie Johnson, spent decades searching for her son's remains and died in 2012, still without ever finding him. To this day, Saddleworth Moor still holds whatever is left of a 12-year-old boy who never made it home from his grandmother's house, and nobody, not the police, not any search team since, not even the killers themselves in their final confessions, has ever been able to say exactly where. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Myra Hindley let a boyfriend's cruelty reshape everything about who she was, turning her into an active partner in 5 children's deaths over 2 years on a quiet English moor. The next woman on this list didn't need years of grooming to get there. She married into a house that was already rotting from the inside, and within a few years, she'd become the more dangerous one in it. Rose West. In the summer of 1992, children living at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester told other people something disturbing. If they misbehaved, they said, they'd end up under the patio, just like their older sister Heather. Nobody who heard that at the time understood what it actually meant. Heather West hadn't been seen since 1986, and her parents, Fred and Rose West, had told various people over the years that she'd moved away and simply lost touch. It would take almost 2 more years and a specific tip passed to social services before police finally acted on that comment and started digging up the garden at Cromwell Street. What they found underneath that patio, and later throughout the rest of the house, turned Fred and Rose West into 2 of the most notorious serial killers in British history. Between 1967 and 1987, at least 12 people were murdered in connection with the Wests, most of them young women and girls, many of them tortured, sexually abused, and dismembered before being buried in the cellar or garden of their home. Rose West is believed responsible, alone or together with her husband, for at least 10 of those deaths, including her own 8-year-old stepdaughter and her own 16-year-old daughter. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on the 29th of November, 1953, in Northam, Devon, the 5th of 7 children in a poor family. Her father, Bill Letts, suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and her mother, Daisy, struggled with depression severe enough that she received electroconvulsive therapy both during and shortly after her pregnancy with Rose. Some who later studied the case have argued that this treatment may have caused developmental harm to Rose before she was even born. Rose grew up moody and withdrawn, did poorly in school, and later alleged that her own father sexually abused her as a child, an allegation that, if true, would mean the pattern of abuse in her life started long before she ever met Fred West. In 1969, at just 15 years old, Rose met 27-year-old Fred West in Cheltenham. Fred was already married at the time to a woman named Catherine Rena Costello and was already stepfather to Rena's daughter from a previous relationship, a young girl named Charmaine. Fred had also already killed once before he ever met Rose. In 1967, while working as a driver, he murdered a young nanny named Anne McFall, whom he had hired to help care for Charmaine. He never confessed to that particular killing, though he did eventually show police where her remains were buried. Rose became pregnant with Fred's child, a daughter they named Heather, in 1970. The couple married on the 29th of January 1972 at Gloucester Register Office, with Fred falsely listing himself as a bachelor on the certificate, since his marriage to Rena had never been formally dissolved, and Rena herself was already dead by then, murdered and dismembered by Fred the previous year. By the time Rose became pregnant with her second child several months later, the family had moved into a new address that would become infamous: 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. The first murder that can be attributed to Rose acting alone happened in June 1971, while Fred was in prison serving a short sentence for the theft of car tires and a vehicle tax disc. With Fred away, Rose was left looking after Charmaine, Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter from his first marriage. In what investigators believe was a sudden fit of rage, Rose strangled the little girl to death. She stored the child's body in the cellar at their previous address on Midland Road, before Fred, once he was released from prison and learned what she'd done, buried Charmaine's remains beneath the kitchen floor of that same house. To cover the killing, Rose told anyone who asked that Charmaine had gone to live with her birth mother in Scotland, a lie she maintained for over 2 decades, right down to sending letters and telling schools the same story. Once both Fred and Rose had crossed the line into killing, once each of them had already gotten away with murdering someone close to their own household, the two of them began actively hunting together. In 1972, they targeted a young woman named Caroline Owens, whom they had hired as a part-time nanny for their growing number of children. When Owens tried to leave the household, the Wests abducted her along a road she was known to hitchhike on, sexually assaulted her, and threatened to kill her if she told anyone. Owens managed to escape and survived, later becoming a key witness against the couple more than 20 years afterward. What the Owens case revealed to investigators, once it finally came to light, was the method the Wests had refined together. Rose, sitting in the passenger seat, made young women feel safer accepting a ride, which made it far easier for Fred to then abduct them once they were in the car. Between 1973 and 1979, at least 7 more young women and girls were murdered and buried at 25 Cromwell Street, most of them in the cellar, later ones in the garden. 19-year-old Linda Goff, a lodger who had grown close to the Wests, went missing in April 1973 and was later found buried beneath the bathroom floor. 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, a resident of a children's home in Worcester, was abducted on the 10th of November 1973 while waiting for a bus after a night out at the cinema with her boyfriend. Her face was bound with surgical tape before she was driven to Cromwell Street, where she was suspended from the cellar's wooden beams before being murdered. 21-year-old Lucy Partington, a university student, disappeared after visiting a friend in Cheltenham that same winter. Therese Siegenthaler, a 21-year-old Swiss exchange student who had been hitchhiking through the area, went missing the following spring. 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard left a work experience placement at a Worcester department store on the 14th of November 1974 and never made it home. 18-year-old Juanita Mott vanished in April 1975, the day before she was due to attend a friend's wedding. Every one of these victims showed evidence of extreme sexual abuse and physical mutilation before death, and every one of them was dismembered, which investigators concluded made it easier for the Wests to fit each body into a small, cramped burial space. The killing paused for a few years before starting again closer to home. Shirley Robinson, a lodger who had become one of Fred's lovers, was around 8 months pregnant with his child when she disappeared in May 1978. Investigators later concluded that Rose, angry about the affair and the pregnancy, told Fred that Robinson had to go. 16-year-old Alison Chambers, a regular visitor to Cromwell Street from a nearby children's home, disappeared in August 1979, shortly before her 17th birthday. Both were buried in the garden rather than the cellar, which by that point had run out of usable space. The final known victim was the West's own daughter, Heather, killed at some point in 1987 when she was 16 years old. Investigators believe Fred had been sexually abusing Heather for years, and that she had either threatened to tell someone outside the family or was simply seen as becoming too old and too resistant to control any longer. Fred and Rose never reported Heather missing, Instead, they told relatives and neighbors she had run away or moved in with friends, the same kind of story they had used to explain away Charmaine's disappearance 16 years earlier. Heather's body was buried directly beneath the patio in the back garden, the same patio their surviving children would later be warned about if they misbehaved. In 1992, police investigated an allegation that Fred and Rose had sexually abused one of their own daughters, but the girl retracted her statement and the charge was dropped, buying the Wests 2 more years of freedom. It wasn't until 1994 that a specific tip, reportedly connected to comments the children had made, reached social services and then the police. Officers obtained a warrant to search the garden at 25 Cromwell Street. In February 1994, they uncovered human remains beneath the patio, later confirmed to be Heather's. When confronted, Fred initially claimed responsibility for everything alone and, after being charged with his daughter's murder, confessed there were 2 more sets of remains buried in the garden. Both were recovered by the 28th of February. Days later, under further questioning, Fred calmly told investigators there were 5 more bodies in the cellar and a 6th beneath the ground floor bathroom. Between the 5th and 8th of March 1994, police recovered all 6, each showing signs of extensive mutilation and sexual violence. Throughout most of his interviews, Fred insisted Rose had no knowledge of what he had done, taking sole responsibility in an apparent effort to protect her. But he also confided separately to Janet Leach, the appropriate adult assigned to sit in on his police interviews, that Rose had in fact murdered Shirley Robinson herself and had personally helped dismember the body, going as far as removing the unborn baby from Robinson's womb. Rose was arrested on the 20th of April 1994, though initially only on unrelated historic charges involving the sexual abuse of a child from years earlier. She was formally charged with the murder of Linda Goff on the 25th of April. By the 6th of May, both Fred and Rose had been jointly charged with 5 counts of murder, a number that would eventually grow to 10 separate charges against Rose alone once investigators finished building their case. Throughout 46 separate police interviews conducted before her trial, Rose's answer to every single murder charge was the same 2 words: "I'm innocent." Fred West never stood trial. On the 1st of January 1995, while being held on remand at HM Prison Birmingham, awaiting his own court date, he killed himself by asphyxiation using torn bedsheets. His death meant Rose would face the entire case alone, with no co-defendant left to share the blame or corroborate her version of events. Her trial began at Winchester Crown Court on the 3rd of October 1995, in front of Mr. Justice Mantell, with prosecutor Brian Levison leading the case against her. Rose denied murdering any of the 10 victims she was charged with, insisting Fred had committed every killing alone and that she had simply been unaware of what was happening inside her own home for over 2 decades. She even claimed at one point to have tried stopping one of Fred's sexual assaults. Against the advice of her own legal team, Rose took the witness stand herself. Her own stepdaughter, Anne-Marie, who had endured years of abuse inside that same house before running away at 15, testified against her, describing what daily life inside 25 Cromwell Street had actually been like. 2 weeks after giving that testimony, Anne-Marie attempted suicide. She would attempt it again in 1999. After 7 weeks of evidence, the judge instructed the jury that circumstantial evidence alone could be enough to convict, and that if 2 people take part in a single murder, the law considers both of them equally guilty, regardless of who physically did the killing. On the 21st and 22nd of November 1995, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts on all 10 counts of murder. Justice Mantell described her crimes as appalling and depraved, sentenced her to life imprisonment, and stated plainly that she should never be released on parole. The Lord Chief Justice later set a minimum term of 25 years, but in July 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw went further and imposed a whole life tariff on Rose West, guaranteeing she would die in prison. She became only the 2nd woman in modern British legal history to receive that sentence, following Myra Hindley in 1990. Rose West's appeal was dismissed in March 1996, with the Lord Chief Justice ruling her conviction was safe and that no retrial was warranted. A further application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 2000 was also declined. In September 2001, she formally withdrew all remaining appeals, writing to the court to accept her sentence, apologize to the victims' families, and state that she expected to die behind bars. Fred's younger brother John hanged himself in his garage in November 1996 while awaiting his own trial for the alleged rape of his niece, Anne-Marie. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was eventually demolished, partly out of respect for the victims and partly because it had become a magnet for so-called dark tourists traveling from around the country just to see the property where it all happened. A public walkway now stands in its place. Rose West remains alive today, held at HM Prison New Hall in West Yorkshire, having spent close to 3 decades in custody, without ever once formally admitting to a single one of the 10 murders a jury unanimously convicted her of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rose West needed a husband already primed for violence to build her body count, someone to help hunt, dismember, and bury alongside her for 2 decades. The next woman on this list needed no partner and no house full of secret graves. She worked entirely alone, inside a hospital ward full of sick children who had no way of knowing the nurse caring for them was the danger. Beverly Allitt. On the 21st of February, 1991, a mother brought her 7-month-old son, Liam Taylor, into the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. Liam had a chest infection, nothing especially serious for a baby his age. The nurse who took over his care that day was calm and reassuring. She told Liam's parents he was in capable hands and gently persuaded them to go home and rest. Later that night, Liam suffered a sudden respiratory emergency while the nurse was alone with him. He survived that first episode, but just before midnight, alone with the same nurse again, his condition collapsed completely. His face turned pale, then broke out in red blotches, and he went into cardiac arrest. Doctors managed to get his heart working again, but the damage to his brain was already done. His parents made the decision to take him off life support days later. His official cause of death was recorded as heart failure in a baby with no history of heart disease. The nurse who had been alone with him during both collapses was 22-year-old Beverly Allitt. Liam Taylor was her first victim. Over the next 59 days, working the same children's ward, Allitt would kill 3 more children and attack 9 others, using nothing more than the drugs already sitting in the hospital's own supply cabinets. Beverly Gale Allitt was born on the 4th of October 1968 in Grantham, Lincolnshire, and grew up in the nearby village of Corby Glen. Her father worked in an off-licence, and her mother worked as a school cleaner. She had 2 sisters and a brother. As a teenager, Allitt showed a pattern that people around her later described as unusual, constantly seeking medical attention for herself, complaining of pains and conditions that doctors could never quite confirm, and volunteering often for babysitting jobs, even though she didn't seem particularly warm toward children. She left school at 16 and enrolled in a nursing course at Grantham College. During her training, she was reported for strange behavior, including smearing human feces on the walls of a nursing home, where she was placed for hands-on experience. She also had an unusually high rate of absence from her coursework, caused by what she described as a constant string of illnesses, and she failed her nursing exams more than once before finally qualifying as a state-enrolled nurse. Despite this shaky record, Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, chronically understaffed and desperate for anyone with a nursing qualification, gave her a temporary 6-month contract in December 1990. She started work on Ward 4, the children's ward, where on a typical shift there were only 2 trained nurses during the day and just 1 at night. That thin level of staffing meant Allitt was frequently left alone with sick children, exactly the kind of opportunity someone with violent intentions could exploit for weeks without anyone noticing. Allitt's motive has never been fully explained in a way that satisfies everyone who has studied the case. But the theory most often put forward by psychiatrists is that she suffered from a form of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder in which a caregiver deliberately causes harm or illness in someone under their care in order to create a crisis, then step forward as the person who responds to it and receives attention and praise for their competence. Allitt had reportedly been turned down for a nursing position at a hospital in Nottingham shortly before Grantham hired her, and colleagues later said she seemed determined to prove herself as capable and indispensable on Ward 4, going out of her way to volunteer for extra shifts and extra night duty around the very children who would later become her victims. 2 weeks after Liam Taylor's death, on the 5th of March 1991, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to Ward 4 after suffering an epileptic seizure. He had cerebral palsy and needed close observation. Alit took over his care, and once again, following a stretch of time when she was left alone with him, she summoned the emergency resuscitation team. They found him without a pulse, his skin turning blue. A pediatric specialist joined the effort to save him, but it was too late. His death was blamed on his existing epilepsy, and no one connected it to the baby who had died in the very same bed just 2 weeks earlier. 3 days after that, on the 8th of March, 1-year-old Kaylee Desmond, who had been admitted for a chest infection and appeared to be recovering well, went into cardiac arrest while Alit was at her side. This time, the resuscitation team managed to save her, and she was transferred to a larger hospital in Nottingham for further care. Doctors there found something the Grantham staff had missed: a strange puncture mark under Kaylee's armpit, with a small air bubble trapped beneath the skin near it. They assumed it was the result of an accidental injection and never launched a formal investigation, a decision that would allow Alit to keep working, unquestioned, for weeks longer. The pattern kept repeating through March. 5-month-old Paul Crampton was admitted on the 20th of March with a minor bronchial infection and, while alone with Alit, went into insulin shock so severe he nearly slipped into a coma on 3 separate occasions before doctors managed to stabilize him. 2 days later, on the 22nd of March, 2-year-old Yik Hung Chan turned blue and appeared to be in serious distress while under Alit's care. He responded to oxygen that time and survived, later being transferred to Nottingham as a precaution, with his symptoms initially blamed on an unrelated skull fracture from a fall. By this point, 5 separate children had suffered sudden, unexplained medical crises on the same ward, all while the same 22-year-old nurse happened to be the one looking after them, and still nobody at the hospital had connected the dots. On the 1st of April 1991, premature twin girls Katie and Becky Phillips, both just 2 months old, were being kept in for routine observation. When a bout of gastroenteritis brought Becky onto the ward, Alit took charge of her care. 2 days later, Alit raised the alarm, claiming Becky seemed hypoglycemic and unusually cold, but medical staff who examined the baby found nothing wrong, and Becky was sent home with her mother. That same night, at home, Becky went into convulsions and cried out in what sounded like severe pain. A doctor was called and suggested it might just be colic. Becky's parents kept her close to them in bed to monitor her through the night. She died before morning. An autopsy could not identify a clear cause of death. Her surviving twin, Katie, was brought into Grantham as a precaution not long afterward, and once again, Alit was the nurse assigned to her care. Katie soon stopped breathing and had to be revived by a resuscitation team. 2 days after that, she suffered another attack, this time severe enough to collapse one of her lungs. She was revived a second time and transferred urgently to Nottingham, where doctors discovered she had 5 broken ribs and had suffered lasting brain damage from lack of oxygen. Katie survived, but with permanent, lifelong injuries. The final victim was 15-month-old Claire Peck, an asthmatic child who was brought onto Ward 4 on the 22nd of April 1991, requiring a breathing tube to help her manage an asthma attack. She was left alone with Alit. Claire went into a fatal cardiac arrest that medical staff were unable to reverse, and unlike some of the earlier cases, evidence later confirmed she had been deliberately poisoned, rather than simply failed by her existing condition. Claire's death was the tipping point. By this stage, hospital staff could no longer explain away the sheer number of children who had suffered sudden, unexplained collapses on one small ward over such a short stretch of time, and questions that should have been raised weeks earlier finally started getting asked out loud. Police were called to Ward 4 on the 30th of April 1991. What they eventually pieced together, after months of painstaking work, was that a total of 25 separate suspicious medical episodes had occurred involving 13 different children, and the only factor every single one of those episodes had in common was the presence of Beverly Alit. Investigators learned that on the 14th of February, just 1 week before Liam Taylor's first collapse, Alit had been handed a set of keys to fetch something from the ward's drug refrigerator, and had shortly afterward reported the refrigerator key missing. Despite an exhaustive search, that key was never recovered, and the lock was replaced the following day, though hospital staff at the time had no idea every refrigerator in the building used an identical lock, meaning a missing key from one ward could unlock drug supplies almost anywhere in the hospital. When investigators finally tested blood samples that had, fortunately, been retained from several of the children, they found dangerously high levels of insulin, potassium, and a heart medication called lignocaine, none of which should have been anywhere near these young patients in those doses. Alit was arrested and questioned on the 21st of May 1991, but the sheer complexity of piecing together dozens of overlapping medical records, staff schedules, and drug logs meant she was not formally charged until that November. Beverly Alit went on trial at Nottingham Crown Court in 1993. She pleaded not guilty to every charge against her. The prosecution laid out a case built on the pattern of her presence at every single incident, on the drug traces recovered from the children's blood, and on the missing refrigerator key that gave her unsupervised access to insulin she had no legitimate reason to be handling. The jury found her guilty of murdering 4 children: Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Becky Phillips, and Claire Peck, of attempting to murder 3 others, and of causing grievous bodily harm with intent to a further 6 children, adding up to 13 separate serious offences in total. In May 1993, Justice David Latham sentenced Beverly Alit to 13 concurrent life sentences, with a minimum term of 30 years before any possibility of parole could even be considered. Addressing her directly, the judge told her she was a serious danger to others and was unlikely ever to be considered safe enough for release. Psychiatrists who examined her for the court concluded she was suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and this diagnosis was presented as mitigation, an explanation for her motive rather than an excuse for her actions. It did not change the length of her sentence. Alit spent only 1 week in an ordinary prison before she stopped eating and drinking entirely, and she was subsequently transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, a high-security psychiatric facility where she has remained for most of the years since her conviction. Years later, in 2018, 2 independent experts, forensic psychiatrist Jeremy Coyd and criminologist Elizabeth Yardley, reviewed her case and concluded she had not actually been mentally ill at the time of her crimes and should have been sent to an ordinary prison rather than a psychiatric hospital, though this reassessment never resulted in her transfer. In December 2007, the High Court formally reaffirmed her original 30-year minimum tariff, clarifying confusion among some victims' families who had mistakenly believed the minimum term was actually 40 years. That 30-year tariff expired in November 2021, technically making her eligible to apply for parole for the first time. In 2023, she appeared before a mental health tribunal that considered transferring her from Rampton to a mainstream prison, a move that would have made her eligible for parole within 6 months if approved. That transfer request was denied in December 2023, and she is not due for another review until 2026 at the earliest. An independent inquiry into the deaths and injuries on Ward 4, chaired by Sir Cecil Clothier, was published in 1994 and found serious systemic failures at the hospital, including chronic understaffing, poor drug security, and a total lack of any formal system for flagging repeated unexplained collapses on the same ward. The inquiry's recommendations went on to shape hospital safety and staffing rules across the entire country. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Beverly Alit turned a ward built to heal sick children into a hunting ground, hiding 4 murders inside a hospital's own routine chaos for 59 straight days before anyone thought to ask why one nurse kept being present every single time a child stopped breathing. The next woman on this list didn't need a hospital ward full of witnesses at all. She worked alone, one lonely patient at a time, and got away with it for nearly a decade before anyone in Victorian London even thought to ask the same simple question. Catherine Wilson. In February 1862, a 54-year-old woman named Sarah Carnell was recovering in her own home on Crawford Street in London. cared for by a live-in nurse named Catherine Wilson. Sarah trusted her completely. Wilson had nursed her through illness for months, and in gratitude, Sarah had recently rewritten her will to leave a large portion of her estate to the woman caring for her. One evening, Wilson brought Sarah a drink she called a soothing draught. Sarah lifted the glass and immediately said it felt strangely warm. She took a sip, and the liquid burned her mouth so badly that she spat it straight onto the carpet. Where it landed, the fabric began to smoke and burn through. The glass Wilson had handed her contained enough sulfuric acid to kill 50 people. Catherine Wilson fled the house before anyone could stop her. That single, badly botched attack finally ended a killing career that stretched back roughly a decade. One built entirely on the same simple trick: befriend the sick and the lonely, convince them to rewrite their wills, and then poison them slowly enough that nobody ever thought to ask questions. Catherine Wilson was born around 1822, though even the basic details of her early life remain uncertain, since she operated under at least one known alias, Constance Taylor, throughout parts of her adult life, and contemporary newspaper accounts of her background often contradicted one another. What is far better documented is her later career. By her late 20s, Wilson was working as a live-in nurse, first in the Lincolnshire town of Spalding and later in Kirkby Lonsdale, in what is now Cumbria. Nursing in Victorian England was a trusted, respected profession, and a good nurse in that era was often given remarkable access to a patient's private life, their finances, their medicine cabinet, and frequently, their final will and testament. Wilson understood this access better than almost anyone, and she built her entire method of killing around exploiting it. Sometime around 1853, or possibly earlier, Wilson entered into a relationship with a young man named James Dixon, whom she lived with as his partner and referred to by some accounts as her husband. Dixon fell seriously ill not long into their relationship, and Wilson nursed him herself. Suspiciously, a bottle of colchicum, a medicine derived from the autumn crocus plant and commonly prescribed for gout in small doses but lethal in larger ones, was later found in his sick room. When Dixon died, the attending doctor recommended a post-mortem examination to confirm the cause of death. Wilson begged him not to go through with it, telling him Dixon had always been terrified of the idea of his body being cut open after death. The doctor, moved by her plea, backed down and signed off on the death without ever performing an autopsy. It was the first time Wilson successfully used sympathy and a grieving partner's supposed final wish to stop anyone from looking too closely at a death that benefited her directly. Around this same period, Wilson took a position as housekeeper to a retired sea captain named Peter Mauer, living in the town of Boston, Lincolnshire. Mauer suffered from gout and, like many gout patients of the era, took regular doses of colchicum to manage the pain. Wilson cared for him attentively and gradually persuaded him to rewrite his will in her favor, cutting out his own brother John in the process. Mauer died in October 1854 after roughly 2 weeks of illness. Because he already took colchicum regularly as a legitimate medicine, his death from what appeared to be an accidental overdose raised no immediate suspicion at all. It was, on paper, simply an old man mismanaging his own gout medicine. Wilson inherited the income Mauer had left her and soon afterward relocated to London, carrying the exact same method with her to a new city full of new potential victims. While living in London, Wilson also spent time visiting and caring for a young mother named Jane Jackson in Boston, introducing herself under the alias Taylor and presenting herself as a nurse, companion, and trusted friend. Jackson's husband, David, was often away from home. During one of these absences, Jane Jackson died. Wilson, using her victim's own identity and paperwork, withdrew nearly £200 from Jackson's bank account, a considerable sum of money at the time. This particular case would later be brought to trial, but in April 1862, a jury acquitted Wilson of the charge, since no clear trace of poison could be found in Jackson's remains by that point. And without physical proof, the circumstantial pattern alone wasn't enough to convict her. Back in London during the mid-1850s, Wilson befriended a woman named Maria Soames, and the two grew close enough that Soames agreed to guarantee a loan for her. At one point, while Soames was away on holiday, her house was reportedly burgled, with silver stolen alongside some of Wilson's own belongings. an incident some later researchers have suspected Wilson may have staged herself to build sympathy and trust. By October 1856, Wilson had grown tired of her relationship with a heavy-drinking man named James, and she began dosing him with colchicum as well. He was diagnosed by an attending doctor with rheumatic fever and died within days. Wilson wrote to his uncle, claiming he had died of consumption, a common and unremarkable cause of death at the time, and successfully talked the doctor out of ordering a post-mortem by insisting, as she had with Dixon, that the deceased had always dreaded the idea of being cut open after death. It was Maria Soames, however, who became Wilson's most significant victim, the one case prosecutors would eventually be able to prove in court. Over an extended period, Wilson administered colchicine to Soames in careful, escalating doses, watching what the prosecution would later describe as excruciating pain and prolonged agony unfold with what the trial judge called deliberate attention. Soames eventually died from the poisoning. At the time, her death was not connected to any wrongdoing, and it would be years before Wilson's growing list of dead patients and companions was ever pieced together into a single, damning pattern. Wilson also lived at various points in Kirkby Lonsdale, where she became close to a milliner named Anne Atkinson, a well-known and respected businesswoman in the town, who ran her own dressmaking shop and travelled to London once a year for trade. Anne Atkinson died in October 1860, following a short but severe illness while staying in London. Her death, like the others, was accepted without much scrutiny at the time. After Atkinson's death, Wilson wrote repeatedly to her widowed husband, Joseph, asking to borrow money, at one point claiming she'd been the victim of a robbery. A man named Thomas Taylor, who Wilson had lived with on and off despite the fact that he had a wife and children elsewhere, later wrote to Joseph Atkinson warning him about her character in strong terms, describing her as an infamous woman. Some accounts suggest Wilson may have attempted to poison Thomas Taylor as well at some point in their relationship, though this was never formally proven in court. By early 1862, suspicion around Anne Atkinson's death had grown enough that her body was exhumed and tested for poison. The first exhumation, in April 1861, found traces of arsenic in her remains. When Wilson's activities came under wider investigation the following year, and Atkinson's body was examined a second time, no arsenic could be detected on that occasion, though experts still concluded that some kind of irritant poison had likely been administered before her death. This inconsistency between the two examinations would later complicate, but not entirely undo, the broader case against her. The event that finally brought Catherine Wilson's decade of killing to an end was her final and most reckless attack against Sarah Carnell in February 1862. For reasons that were never fully explained, rather than using her usual slower-acting colchicum, Wilson instead prepared a soothing draught laced with sulfuric acid strong enough to kill dozens of people at once. When Sarah spat the burning liquid out and her husband found the acid had scorched holes through the carpet where it landed, there was no ambiguity left to hide behind. Wilson fled the house immediately, and her sudden disappearance was, in the eyes of investigators, almost a confession in itself. She evaded capture for roughly 6 weeks before an off-duty police officer happened to recognize her on the street and took her into custody. Wilson's first appearance before a court, at Marylebone Police Court in April 1862, dealt only with the attempted murder of Sarah Carnell. Her defense argued that a chemist's assistant had mistakenly handed her the wrong bottle, giving her sulfuric acid instead of the harmless soothing medicine she claimed she'd actually intended to deliver. To the shock of much of the courtroom, the jury believed this explanation and acquitted her of the charge. Wilson was free to walk out of the dock. She did not stay free for long. Detectives who had spent months quietly investigating the pattern of deaths connected to her had already gathered enough separate evidence to arrest her again the moment she stepped outside, this time on suspicion of multiple counts of murder connected to her previous patients and companions. Authorities exhumed the bodies of several people Wilson had cared for over the years, and traces of poison, arsenic in some cases and colchicine in others, were found in a number of them. Given the strength of the physical evidence tied to Maria Soames's death specifically, prosecutors chose to build their capital case around that single killing rather than attempt to prove every suspected death at once. Catherine Wilson stood trial at the Old Bailey in September 1862, before Mr. Justice Biles, charged with the willful murder of Maria Soames. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense, led by Montague Williams, argued that so many years had passed since Soames's death that any poison in her body could no longer be reliably detected or attributed to a specific cause, a defense built entirely on the passage of time rather than any claim of innocence. The prosecution called toxicologist Alfred Swain Taylor, a respected expert of the era, who testified that Soames's symptoms before death were entirely consistent with colchicine poisoning. In his closing remarks to the jury, Justice Biles said plainly that if this kind of behavior were allowed to continue unchecked, no person in the country could sit down to a meal and feel truly safe. The jury took roughly 2 hours to reach their decision. They found Catherine Wilson guilty of willful murder. Justice Biles sentenced her to death. He would later tell her own defense lawyer, privately, away from the courtroom, that Wilson's counsel had just finished defending what he personally believed was the greatest criminal who had ever lived. Wilson never confessed to any of her killings, and she attempted an appeal, arguing there had been no definitive proof she had ever poisoned Soames at all. Her appeal failed, and no one stepped forward to plead further on her behalf. Catherine Wilson was executed by hanging outside Newgate Prison on the 20th of October, 1862. A crowd estimated at around 20,000 people gathered to witness it, many having waited outside overnight, through heavy rain, just to secure a place close to the gallows. It had been 14 years since any woman had last been executed in the county of Middlesex, which only added to the scale of public fascination surrounding her death. Catherine Wilson holds the distinction of being the last woman ever publicly hanged in London, since public executions in England were abolished entirely just a few years later, in 1868. Newspapers at the time gave her lasting morbid nicknames, calling her a female Palmer, a reference to William Palmer, another notorious poisoner of the era, and describing her outright as a perfect Borgia, invoking the infamous poisoning reputation of Italy's Borgia family centuries earlier. In the end, Catherine Wilson was legally convicted of only one murder, that of Maria Soames, the single case prosecutors could prove beyond doubt in a courtroom. But investigators and the wider public at the time believed she was responsible for at least 6 or 7 deaths across roughly a decade, spanning Peter Mauer, James Dixon, the man she poisoned during their relationship in 1856, Jane Jackson, and Anne Atkinson, alongside her final, failed attempt on Sarah Carnell. Every one of her victims shared the same tragic vulnerability. They were sick, lonely, or recently widowed, and they had no reason to suspect the trusted nurse sitting by their bedside was quietly rewriting their future the same way she was rewriting their wills. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Catherine Wilson got away with poisoning trusting, sickly strangers for the better part of 10 years, simply because nobody in Victorian England thought to connect one nurse's name to so many separate, unrelated deaths spread across different towns. The next 2 women on this list didn't need years of patience or a single clever alias to build their body count. They ran their entire operation together, out of one house, taking in desperate mothers' babies by the dozen and killing them so routinely that police eventually stopped counting the bodies pulled from the river and started counting the ones they still hadn't found. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters. On the morning of the 18th of November, 1902, a police detective named George Wright watched a 54-year-old woman named Annie Walters step out of a house on Danbury Street in Islington, carrying a bundle cradled in her arms, the exact way a person carries a live baby. Officers had been watching that house since the day before, acting on a tip. They followed Walters as she boarded a bus, glancing back repeatedly to see if anyone was behind her, before she got off near South Kensington Underground Station and walked around outside for several minutes, clearly nervous. She eventually went into the ladies' lavatory inside the station. When Detective Wright finally caught up to her and looked inside her bundle, he found a dead baby boy hidden beneath the wrappings. Walters would go on to admit, once she was in custody, that she had given the infant 2 little drops of a medicine called chlorodyne in his milk, the same drug she used on herself, and that she had simply meant to help him sleep. She also gave police a name. She said a woman called Mrs. Satch would know where another baby was. That single admission unraveled one of the most disturbing baby farming operations of the entire Victorian and Edwardian era, run by two women, Amelia Sachs and Annie Walters, who together are believed to have killed dozens of infants over roughly 2 years, charging desperate mothers a fee for a fresh start that was, in almost every case, a death sentence for their child. Amelia Sachs's background, unlike her partner's, is well documented. She was baptized Frances Amelia Thorne on the 5th of May, 1867, in the village of Hampreston in Dorset, the fourth of 10 children in her family. She married a builder named Geoffrey Sachs in 1896 and, according to the 1901 census, had a daughter of her own named Lillian, born in Clapham. Sachs was a qualified, certificated midwife, a genuinely respectable and trusted profession, which made her advertisements all the more convincing to the young women who answered them. By around 1900, she was running what was called a lying-in home, a private house where pregnant women could stay quietly through their confinement and give birth away from the eyes of family, employers, and neighbours. She first operated from a house on Stanley Road, before moving her business to a semi-detached red brick villa in East Finchley called Claymore House. Annie Walters, by contrast, remains a far murkier figure. She had been married at some point, though little else about her early life survives in any reliable record. She had a serious drinking problem and appeared to be dependent on chlorodyne herself, a widely available medicine mixing morphine, chloroform, and cannabis, originally sold as a treatment for cholera. She periodically advertised herself around London as a sick nurse, which is likely how she first came into contact with Amelia Sachs. Illegitimacy in Edwardian Britain carried a crushing social penalty, one that fell almost entirely on women. An unmarried domestic servant who became pregnant faced immediate dismissal, and once dismissed, she often struggled to find any employer willing to take her on again, since a baby out of wedlock was treated as proof of moral failure rather than simple bad luck. Amelia Sachs's advertisements offered these women, and often their employers as well, exactly the discreet solution they were desperate for. A woman could come stay at Claymore House, deliver her baby under Sachs's professional care as a midwife, and then pay a further adoption fee, typically between £25 and £30, a considerable sum at the time, so that the child could be placed with a new family and the mother could quietly return to her old life as though nothing had happened. Most of the women who used Sachs's services, based on later witness accounts, were domestic servants whose employers were just as eager as the mothers themselves to see the whole situation disappear without any public scandal attached to their household. The truth behind that promised adoption was almost always the opposite of what these mothers believed they were paying for. Once a baby was born at Claymore House, Sachs would send a telegram summoning Annie Walters, often instructing her to collect the infant at Finchley railway station. One surviving telegram from the case was dated the 12th of November and came directly from Sachs in East Finchley. Walters would take the baby back to her rented room in Islington, and it was there, away from Sachs's own address and away from any of the mothers who had handed their children over in good faith, that the killing actually took place. Walters would administer a lethal dose of chlorodyne to the infant, usually mixed into its bottle of milk. In most cases, the drug caused the baby to slip into a fatal sleep, asphyxiating quietly as its breathing slowed and eventually stopped. In cases where the dose alone didn't finish the job fast enough, Walters would smother the child instead. She then disposed of the small bodies however she could manage discreetly, dropping some into the River Thames and leaving others among ordinary household rubbish, treating the disposal of a dead infant with the same casual practicality she might have applied to any other unwanted household waste. This routine repeated itself for roughly 2 years, from around 1900 through late 1902, with neither woman ever being connected to a single one of the deaths during that entire stretch. When police finally searched Claymore House after the arrests, they found approximately 300 separate items of baby clothing stored in Amelia Sachs's own bedroom, far more than could ever be explained by the handful of children she might have legitimately placed for adoption. That single detail, 300 tiny garments belonging to children nobody could account for, gave investigators, and later a jury, a visceral sense of just how many infants had actually passed through that house and never come out the other side. Nobody has ever been able to establish a confirmed total number of victims. Some later estimates place the true toll as high as 20 infants or more, while a small number of researchers examining the case have suggested the real figure could run even higher, though these larger numbers rest on inference and suspicion rather than solid documentary or forensic proof. What is certain is that dozens of babies were handed over to Sash and Walters by trusting mothers who believed they were giving their children a second chance at life, and that only a small number of those children were ever conclusively accounted for as living or dead. The operation finally came undone because of a tip that led police to start watching Annie Walters' Islington address on the 17th of November 1902. Officers positioned themselves in a neighbouring house with a clear view of her front door. The following morning, they watched Walters leave carrying her telltale bundle, followed her onto a bus, and trailed her all the way to South Kensington Station, where Detective Wright finally intervened and discovered the dead infant boy hidden inside the wrapping. At the police station, Walters admitted giving the baby chlorodyne, though she insisted she had only meant to make him sleep and that she had genuinely intended to kill herself rather than the child, a claim investigators treated with considerable skepticism given the pattern that was about to emerge. Crucially, Walters told police that Mrs. Satch knows where the other baby is, explaining that she had returned a second infant to Satch the previous Friday, and she handed over details of the telegram system the two women used to coordinate handovers at Finchley Station. That single piece of cooperation was enough for investigators to move directly on Claymore House. There, the discovery of roughly 300 pieces of unclaimed baby clothing, combined with the telegrams Walters had described, gave police more than enough evidence to charge Amelia Satch as an accessory to murder alongside Walters herself. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters stood trial together at the Central Criminal Court, commonly known as the Old Bailey, on the 15th and 16th of January 1903, before Mr. Justice Darling. The specific charge brought against them centred on the murder of an infant boy whose mother, a woman named Ada Galley, had given him up to Satch's care shortly before his death. Both women pleaded not guilty, and neither took the witness stand in her own defence during the trial. An all-male jury, as was standard for the era, heard the evidence laid out against them, including the telegrams, the baby clothing recovered from Claymore House, and Walters's own admissions about the chlorodyne. The jury took only about 40 minutes to reach a decision. They found both women guilty of willful murder, though they added a formal recommendation of mercy on account of the defendant's sex, a request that judges of the period were not obligated to honour, and in this case, chose not to. Newspaper coverage of the trial and verdict was fierce and largely unsympathetic, with the press denouncing what one report called a horrible and extensive traffic in babies, and describing the pair's conduct in terms meant to strip away any lingering Victorian assumption that women were inherently incapable of this kind of calculated, repeated cruelty. The story was picked up by newspapers as far away as Australia. In the weeks following the verdict, a local campaign in the Finchley area petitioned for both women's death sentences to be commuted to life imprisonment instead, a common appeal in cases involving female defendants at the time. That campaign failed completely, and the death sentences handed down by Justice Darling stood without any further reduction. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters were hanged together at Holloway Prison on the morning of the 3rd of February 1903, executed by Henry Pierpoint, who would later become the father of Albert Pierpoint, one of the most prolific executioners in British history. Accounts from witnesses at the execution describe a stark contrast between the two women in their final moments. Satch reportedly had to be physically carried to the scaffold, apparently overcome by fear and distress. Walters, by comparison, remained calm throughout, and is said to have called out, "Goodbye, Satch," to her former partner in crime just before the hood was placed over her head. Their joint execution made them the first women ever hanged at Holloway Prison, and it remains the only double hanging of two women carried out in Britain in the modern era. Their bodies were initially buried in unmarked graves within the prison walls, following standard practice for executed prisoners at the time, and were later reinterred together at Brookwood Cemetery, sharing a single grave alongside two other women who had also been executed at Holloway Prison decades apart, marked today by one shared grey granite tombstone. The case of Amelia Satch and Annie Walters became one of the final major baby farming scandals of its kind, to shock the British public. Arriving roughly 6 years after Amelia Dyer's execution had already exposed the same underlying horror to the nation. Claymore House itself became so notorious afterward that the building's name was quietly removed from its front plaque, leaving it anonymous rather than forever associated with what had happened inside it. The exact number of children who died at the hands of Sash and Walters will likely never be known with any certainty, buried as it is beneath 2 years of destroyed records, untraceable disposals, and a business built entirely on secrecy from the very beginning. What is certain is that every single mother who walked into Claymore House believing she was giving her child a second chance at life was, in nearly every documented case, unknowingly signing that child's death warrant instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Amelia Satch and Annie Walters built their entire operation around exploiting a mother's desperation and a stranger's promise of discretion, killing quietly and efficiently for 2 years before one careless bus ride exposed everything. The next woman on this list needed no accomplice and no elaborate business to hide behind. She poisoned the people closest to her, one at a time, inside her own home, and very nearly got away with it, simply because nobody expected the danger to come from someone who shared their own dinner table. Mary Ann Britland. On the evening of the 13th of May, 1886, Mary Ann Britland sat down for supper at the home of her neighbours, Thomas and Mary Dixon, on Turner Lane in Ashton-under-Lyne. Mary Dixon, 29 years old, had been nothing but kind to her, taking her in as a house guest after a string of terrible losses. Shortly after the meal ended, Mary Dixon fell seriously ill. A doctor was called to attend her through the night, but nothing could be done. She died in the early hours of the following morning. Her death certificate listed the cause as abdominal spasms, an unremarkable, almost forgettable explanation for a sudden death in Victorian England. It was in fact the third death connected to Mary Ann Britland in barely 2 months, following the deaths of her own 19-year-old daughter in March and her own 44-year-old husband in early May. All 3 had died with strikingly similar symptoms. All 3 deaths had gone entirely unquestioned, right up until the moment a neighbour laying out Mary Dixon's body noticed something familiar. Her hands, clenched tight, exactly as they had been on the last body this same neighbour had prepared for burial just weeks earlier. Mary Ann Britland was born Mary Ann Haig in 1847, in Bolton, Lancashire, the second eldest daughter of Joseph and Hannah Haig. In 1866, she married Thomas Britland at St Michael's Church in Ashton-under-Lyne. The couple settled into a rented house at 133 Turner Lane, in the same town, and had 2 daughters together, Elizabeth Hannah and Susanna. To support the household, Mary Ann worked 2 jobs, spending her days in a factory and her evenings pulling pints as a barmaid, a demanding routine typical of a working-class family in industrial Lancashire at the time. From the outside, the Britlands looked like an entirely ordinary family, indistinguishable from thousands of others living on similar streets across the mill towns of northern England. In February 1886, Mary Ann told a local chemist that her home had become infested with mice, and she purchased several packets of a product called Harrison's Vermin Killer. Because this particular pest control mixture contained both strychnine and arsenic, 2 genuinely dangerous poisons, the chemist was legally required to have her sign the poison register before handing it over, a routine safety measure meant to track who was buying lethal substances and why. Mary Ann didn't buy it just once. She returned to the chemist and purchased it again on more than one occasion, always repeating the same story about a mouse problem that never seemed to actually go away. Investigators would later find no real evidence that her home had ever had a serious infestation at all. What she had built for herself, quietly and legally, was a personal stockpile of poison large enough to kill several people, purchased under a cover story so mundane that nobody thought to question it. The real motive behind Mary Ann's purchases had nothing to do with mice. She had become infatuated with a neighbour living just across the street at number 128 Turner Lane, a man named Thomas Dixon, and by most accounts of the time, the 2 of them were either already having an affair or Mary Ann was pursuing one with an intensity that bordered on obsession, regardless of how much genuine interest Dixon himself actually returned. Standing between Mary Ann and the life she wanted with Dixon were three people: her own husband, her own eldest daughter, and Dixon's wife. Over the following months, she eliminated all three, one at a time, using the poison she had already legally purchased and quietly stored away. The first to die was Mary Ann's own daughter, 19-year-old Elizabeth Hannah, in March 1886. The attending doctor, seeing nothing unusual to raise his suspicion in an era with limited food safety standards and no refrigeration to speak of, attributed the death to natural causes without a second thought. Mary Ann waited only a short time before filing a claim on Elizabeth's life insurance policy, collecting £10. She later confessed that she had killed her own daughter, specifically because she believed Elizabeth had figured out what her mother was planning and might expose her. Her next victim was her husband, Thomas, who died on the 3rd of May 1886 at the age of 44. His death was diagnosed as epilepsy, another explanation that raised no immediate alarm, and Mary Ann once again filed an insurance claim, this time collecting a larger sum on his policy. Devastated, or at least appearing to be, by the sudden loss of both a daughter and a husband within the same 2-month stretch, Mary Ann found herself taken in with genuine sympathy by her neighbours. Mary Dixon, entirely unaware of the role Mary Ann had actually played in her own recent bereavements, invited her and her surviving daughter, Susanna, to come stay in the Dixon household. It was an act of simple neighbourly kindness that placed Mary Ann's final obstacle directly under the same roof she was already living in. 10 days after moving in, Mary Ann shared supper with the Dixons on the evening of the 13th of May. Mary Dixon fell ill shortly afterward and was dead by the following morning, her symptoms mirroring almost exactly what had been seen in both previous deaths. A woman named Mrs. Lord, who had also helped lay out the bodies of both Elizabeth Britland and Thomas Britland in the weeks before, was asked to prepare Mary Dixon's body as well. She noticed the same unusual signs she had seen twice already, most strikingly the way the hands had clenched tight, a detail rare enough that seeing it a third time in the same household within 2 months was impossible to dismiss as pure coincidence. The day after Mary Dixon's death, a local cafe owner named John Law visited the house to arrange catering for the funeral. Mary Ann answered the door, and Law later described being genuinely unsettled by the strange questions she asked him about poison during their conversation, including openly mentioning that she'd purchased rodent killer and asking whether she had ever told Thomas Dixon about it. Word of the third near-identical death spread quickly through the neighbourhood, and suspicion finally caught up with Mary Ann Britland. Police interviewed her directly in connection with Mary Dixon's death, and a pathologist examined the body, finding a lethal quantity of both arsenic and strychnine still present in her system. When investigators went back to check the 2 earlier deaths, they found traces of arsenic in both Thomas and Elizabeth Britland's remains as well, though strychnine itself had already broken down and left the body too quickly to be detected by the time those particular autopsies took place. Mary Ann was arrested immediately, and so was Thomas Dixon, given his obvious connection to both the victim and the suspect. Investigators quickly established that Dixon had played no part whatsoever in his own wife's murder. At Ashton Police Station, Mary Ann gave a full confession. She admitted she had wanted to marry Thomas Dixon, and that she had poisoned her own daughter first because she believed Elizabeth suspected what she was planning. She then admitted to poisoning her husband, and finally, Mary Dixon herself. Mary Ann Britland was formally charged with all 3 murders, but prosecutors chose to bring her to trial specifically over the killing of Mary Dixon, the case with the freshest and most conclusive physical evidence. The 2 earlier deaths, of her daughter and her husband, were still presented to the jury, not as separate charges, but as evidence of what the prosecution called a system, a deliberate, repeated pattern meant to prove that Mary Dixon's death could not possibly have been an accident or coincidence. Her trial opened on the 22nd of July 1886 at Manchester Assizes before Mr. Justice Cave, with a barrister named Mr. Addison leading the prosecution and Mr. Blair representing her defence. With no way to challenge the confession or the physical evidence directly, Blair built his entire defence around the absence of a strong financial motive, arguing that the small insurance payouts Mary Ann had collected, £10 here, £20 there, were far too little money to plausibly justify murdering 3 separate people. Justice Cave told the jury plainly that they did not need to find a motive at all in order to convict her. They simply needed to be certain she had committed the killings. The jury struggled with their decision far more than the strength of the evidence might suggest. After deliberating for roughly 2 hours, the jury foreman told the judge they could not reach a verdict. Justice Cave sent them back to continue. By 10 o'clock that same night, they still hadn't reached a conclusion. It eventually took the better part of 2 days before the jury finally returned, delivering a unanimous verdict of guilty. Mary Ann Britland was sentenced to death. Standing in the dock after hearing her sentence, she declared to the court, "I am quite innocent. I am not guilty at all." A flat denial that directly contradicted the detailed confession she had already given to police at Ashton Station months earlier. Whether this final claim of innocence reflected genuine denial, simple panic, or a last desperate attempt to avoid the gallows, no record from the case offers a clear answer. Mary Ann Britland was executed on the morning of the 9th of August 1886 at Strangeways Prison in Manchester, hanged by executioner James Berry in what was only his second execution of a woman. She was in such a severe state of collapse that morning that 2 female warders had to physically support her on the walk to the scaffold, and 2 male warders were needed to hold her upright on the trapdoor itself while Berry finished his preparations. According to reports from witnesses present, her final words were a desperate plea for mercy, calling out to God as she stood on the trapdoor. Berry gave her a drop of 7 feet, and death was reported to have been instantaneous. Mary Ann Britland became the very first woman ever executed at Strangeways Prison, a distinction that would be repeated only 3 more times in the prison's entire history over the following decades. Mary Ann Britland's case followed a pattern that had already claimed dozens of lives across Victorian Britain by the time she was caught. An ordinary-seeming woman with legal access to household poison, a small insurance policy attached to each victim, and a doctor willing to sign off on a death without asking too many questions. What finally caught her wasn't a clever piece of forensic science or a suspicious detective. It was one working-class neighbour's memory of a dead woman's clenched hands, recognised a 3rd time in the same small stretch of houses, in the same short handful of weeks. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mary Ann Britland needed nothing more than a chemist's poison register and 3 unsuspecting people standing between her and the life she wanted to build with someone else's husband. The next woman on this list didn't plan anything nearly so patient or calculated. She picked up a knife over the course of 10 violent days in 2013 and left a trail of bodies in roadside ditches, later telling police, without a shred of remorse, that 3 men simply hadn't been enough for her. Joanna Dennehy. On the 2nd of April 2013, 64-year-old Robin Bereza was walking his dog near Hereford, doing something entirely ordinary, something he had probably done hundreds of times before without a second thought. A car pulled up. A woman got out, walked toward him, and stabbed him in the shoulder without a word of warning. Bereza later said the woman simply stared through him as she attacked, showing no anger, no panic, nothing recognizable at all. He survived. The woman who stabbed him was Joanna Dennehy, and by the time she reached Hereford that afternoon, she had already murdered 3 men back in Cambridgeshire over the previous 10 days, stabbing each of them to death and dumping their bodies in roadside ditches on the outskirts of Peterborough. She wasn't finished either. Within the same hour she attacked Bereza, she targeted a second stranger walking his dog nearby, stabbing him dozens of times and stealing his dog before police finally caught up with her. Dennehy would go on to become one of the very few women in modern British history sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison with absolutely no possibility of ever being released. Joanna Christine Dennehy was born in August 1982 in St Albans, Hertfordshire, and grew up in nearby Harpenden, a comfortable, affluent commuter town that gave her a far more stable upbringing than almost any other woman on this list ever had. By 2013, at the age of 30, she was living an entirely different kind of life. She had 2 young children with a former partner named John, but by the time of the murders she had become largely absent from their day-to-day lives, with the children living with their father roughly 15 miles away in Glossop, while Dennehy herself moved to Peterborough. There, She rented a bedsit from a local property developer and landlord named Kevin Lee, with whom she had also become romantically involved, and she shared that same small living space with a housemate named John Chapman. She was heavily involved in drink and drug use throughout this period, and she was easily identifiable by a distinctive green star tattoo beneath her right eye, a detail police would later use to help track her down. Psychiatrists who examined Dennehy after her arrest diagnosed her with a combination of psychopathic, antisocial, and borderline personality disorders, along with what court proceedings described as paraphilic sadomasochism. She would later tell a psychiatrist that she found killing to be Moorish, explaining that after her first murder, she simply got a taste for it, a chilling admission that framed the killings not as crimes of passion or desperation, but as something closer to an addiction she was actively feeding. Around the same period, her landlord and lover, Kevin Lee, had served her and her boyfriend, a 7-foot 3-inch tall man named Gary Stretch, an eviction notice, requiring them to vacate the bedsit so it could be renovated. Investigators later pointed to this eviction as a possible piece of the motive behind Lee's murder, though by every account of Dennehy's own stated mindset, motive in any conventional sense barely applied to what she was about to do. She had met her first victim, a 31-year-old Polish national named Łukasz Slaboszewski, only a few days earlier, after he received a series of suggestive messages from her and made his way to meet her, apparently expecting to spend the night together. What followed took place over roughly 10 days in March 2013. Sometime between the 19th and the 29th of March, Dennehy lured Slaboszewski to a property in Peterborough. Instead of the encounter he was expecting, she stabbed him once through the heart with a pocket knife. She stored his body inside a wheelie bin afterward, and in a detail that speaks to just how detached she was from any normal human reaction to what she'd done, she later brought a 14-year-old girl she had befriended locally to come see the corpse. On the 29th of March, she turned on her own housemate, 56-year-old John Chapman, a Falklands War veteran who had struggled for years with drink and drug addiction and who was, according to court evidence, intoxicated at the time she attacked him. She stabbed him repeatedly in the neck and chest inside the same small bedsit they shared. Immediately afterward, she called Gary Stretch and delivered the news with a casualness that stunned investigators later reviewing the case, telling him, "Oops, I've done it again." That same day, she murdered her landlord and lover, Kevin Lee, stabbing him in the chest. His body was dumped in a ditch near the village of Newborough, where a member of the public discovered it on the 30th of March, becoming the first of the 3 bodies to surface and setting off a full police manhunt. Detectives investigating Kevin Lee's death launched a nationwide appeal within a day of finding his body, publicly naming Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch as the 2 people they urgently wanted to locate. A senior investigating officer described the pair to the media as strikingly distinctive in appearance, pointing to Stretch's unusual 7-foot 3-inch height and Dennehy's visible green facial tattoo as details the public could easily recognize. While that appeal was still circulating, on the 3rd of April, a passerby stumbled across 2 more bodies dumped in open fen land at Thorney Dyke, a short distance from Peterborough. They were Łukasz Slaboszewski and John Chapman, both showing multiple stab wounds consistent with the same weapon used on Kevin Lee. By the time those 2 bodies were actually found, however, Dennehy herself was already roughly 140 miles away. She had fled with Gary Stretch, along with a 3rd man named Mark Lloyd, who later insisted he had travelled with them unwillingly and was ultimately cleared of any criminal involvement in what came next. On the 2nd of April, in the area around Hereford, the trio encountered Robin Bereza walking his dog. Dennehy got out of the car and stabbed him without any provocation, leaving him with serious injuries he nonetheless survived. Shortly afterward, she targeted a second dog walker, 56-year-old John Rogers, stabbing him approximately 40 separate times and stealing the dog he'd been walking. Rogers, remarkably, also survived his injuries. Both men were found by a passerby who came to their aid. Police tracked Dennehy down that same day using CCTV footage that captured her stopping to buy tobacco at a service station during the drive to Hereford. That footage led officers to a green Vauxhall Astra parked in Newman Close, in the Newton Farm area of Hereford. Officers approached the vehicle and arrested both Dennehy and Stretch without any resistance or incident. When they searched her, they found a 9-centimeter pocket knife on her person, still caked in dried blood. Mark Lloyd later told investigators that during the drive, Dennehy had spoken openly about wanting to be like Bonnie and Clyde, and that she had specifically wanted to kill 9 men in total, a number she never came close to reaching, only because police caught her first. In November 2013, Joanna Dennehy appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to all 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 3 separate counts of preventing the lawful and decent burial of her victims. Her guilty plea reportedly came as a genuine surprise, even to her own defense barrister. Her sister, Maria, later said she wasn't surprised at all by the decision, explaining that Dennehy liked people to know she was the one in control of any given situation. During the subsequent proceedings at the Old Bailey, Dennehy could be seen visibly laughing in the dock, and when questioned directly about her guilty plea, she responded simply, "I have pleaded guilty, and that's that." At one point during the hearing, she stood up unprompted and addressed the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, directly, telling him, "I don't want to be controlled by anybody. I don't want to be controlled by my lawyers, by the police, by anybody." 2 of her associates, Gary Stretch and a man named Leslie Layton, stood trial separately on charges connected to assisting her and helping dispose of the bodies, and both declined to give evidence in their own defense. A third man, Robert Moore, pleaded guilty to helping the group evade capture during their flight to Hereford. On the 28th of February 2014, Mr. Justice Spencer sentenced Joanna Dennehy to life imprisonment, adding a whole life order that guaranteed she would never be considered for release under any circumstance, a decision he based directly on the clear premeditation behind each of her 3 murders. Addressing her in court, he told her plainly, "Within the space of 10 days you murdered 3 men in cold blood," and added that, although she had pleaded guilty, she had made it perfectly clear she felt no remorse whatsoever for what she'd done. He described her as a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer, further noting that she displayed sadomasochistic tendencies and appeared to lack the normal range of human emotion that might otherwise account for or temper this kind of violence. With that sentence, Joanna Dennehy became only the 3rd woman in the entire history of the United Kingdom to receive a whole life tariff, following 2 names already familiar by this point in British criminal history, Myra Hindley and Rosemary West. Joanna Dennehy has spent the years since her conviction held in high-security custody, including a period at HM Prison Bronzefield in Surrey. She was later reported to have been moved to HM Prison Low Newton in County Durham, where, according to press reports at the time, she made threats against a fellow inmate, Rose West, prompting prison officials to relocate West to a different facility entirely in 2019, as a precaution, although officials publicly denied that the reported threat was the genuine reason behind that particular transfer. Dennehy's case, and her own chilling account of finding murder moorish, has since been the subject of documentary coverage examining exactly what drove a woman from a stable, comfortable background to kill 3 strangers and acquaintances alike within the span of 10 days, purely, by her own account, for the thrill of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Joanna Dennehy killed for nothing more than her own entertainment, working through 3 men in 10 days with a knife, and no real motive beyond the taste she'd developed for it. The final woman on this list worked inside a hospital rather than a getaway car, and unlike every other name on this list, the argument over whether she's even guilty at all is still being fought out in British courtrooms right now. Lucy Letby. Between June 2015 and June 2016, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital experienced a sharp and statistically unusual rise in infant deaths and sudden, unexplained collapses. Doctors on the ward began quietly comparing notes, and by the middle of that stretch, several senior consultants noticed the same name kept appearing in connection with nearly every incident, a 25-year-old nurse named Lucy Letby. In August 2023, following one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in English legal history, Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder several others, and was handed a whole life order, making her the most prolific convicted child killer in modern British history. Her case belongs on this list because of that verdict, But it also belongs here, with an asterisk no other name on this list carries. As of 2026, a formal government body is actively reviewing whether that verdict was actually correct, and a growing number of doctors, statisticians, and legal experts from around the world have publicly argued it wasn't. Lucy Letby was born in 1990 in Hereford. She trained as a nurse at the University of Chester and qualified in 2011, joining the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital not long afterward. By most accounts from people who knew her before her arrest, she lived what colleagues and neighbours described as an unremarkable life. She took salsa dancing classes in her spare time and regularly volunteered to pick up extra overtime shifts on the ward, a detail prosecutors would later present very differently than the colleagues who had once seen it as simple dedication to her job. Starting in June 2015, the neonatal unit began recording infant deaths and sudden collapses at a rate well beyond what staff had seen in previous years. Several consultant doctors began raising concerns internally as early as 2015 and into 2016, pointing specifically to Letby's presence on shift during an unusually high proportion of these incidents. According to evidence that would later be presented at trial, a handwritten staffing chart, sometimes referred to as a decision matrix, appeared to track which nurse was on duty against each unexplained collapse, and Letby's name lined up with the pattern far more often than any of her colleagues. Hospital management was slow to act on the doctor's concerns, and there was reportedly considerable internal tension between the consultants pushing for an investigation and administrators reluctant to escalate the matter. Letby was eventually removed from clinical duties on the ward and reassigned to clerical work in July 2016. It would still be almost a year before Cheshire Police formally opened a criminal investigation, known as Operation Hummingbird, in May 2017. Letby was arrested multiple times over the following years as detectives built their case, and she was formally charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder in November 2020. Prosecutors alleged that between June 2015 and June 2016, Letby had deliberately harmed at least 17 infants on the ward using several different methods, including injecting air into the bloodstream or feeding tubes of some babies, deliberately overfeeding others with milk to the point of causing them to choke or aspirate, poisoning at least one infant with insulin, and in some instances causing blunt physical trauma. It's important to state plainly what kind of evidence this case was built on, because it sets it apart from the physical evidence at the heart of the other cases on this list. There was no forensic evidence directly tying Letby to any specific act of harm. There was no CCTV footage of her doing anything to any child. There was no eyewitness who ever saw her commit an act of violence against a patient. The case presented to the jury instead relied heavily on the staffing pattern connecting her presence to each incident, on expert medical testimony arguing that certain collapses were consistent with deliberate harm rather than natural causes, and on handwritten notes recovered from her home during a police search, including one note in which she had written that she was evil and had done this, a piece of evidence prosecutors presented to the jury as significant. Letby's trial opened at Manchester Crown Court in October 2022, relocated from the original Cheshire venue given the scale of media attention surrounding the case. The trial ran for months, with the jury hearing testimony from medical experts on both the prosecution and defence sides, alongside evidence from the parents of the infants involved. In August 2023, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Letby on 7 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, while remaining undecided on a small number of additional charges. A separate retrial held in 2024, focused specifically on one of those undecided counts, resulted in a further guilty verdict for attempted murder. Taken together across both trials, Letby was ultimately convicted on a combined total of 15 separate charges of murder and attempted murder, in part because at least one surviving child had been the subject of 2 separate charged attacks on 2 different occasions. Letby was sentenced in August 2023 to whole life imprisonment, receiving 1 whole life order for each of the 15 offences she had been convicted of, meaning she will never become eligible for release under any circumstances, regardless of any future parole process. The sentencing made her Britain's most prolific convicted killer of children in modern legal history. She is widely reported, though not officially confirmed by prison authorities, to be held at HMP Bronzefield in Surrey. What has happened since that sentencing is where this case becomes genuinely unlike anything else on this list. Letby's legal team pursued two separate appeals against her convictions in July 2024 and October 2024, and both were rejected by the courts, which found no arguable basis to challenge either the trial evidence or the legal process that had been followed. Despite those failed appeals, a growing body of medical professionals began publicly challenging the underlying science the prosecution's case had rested on. A panel eventually involving more than a dozen international specialists reviewed the medical evidence and argued that many of the collapses attributed to deliberate harm were, in their assessment, more consistent with natural causes or with documented failings in the standard of neonatal care the hospital itself was providing at the time, rather than with intentional injury. In February 2025, Letby's barrister, Mark MacDonald, submitted an application on her behalf to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body responsible for investigating potential miscarriages of justice in England and Wales. Additional material continued to be submitted throughout the following year, culminating in a February 2026 dossier containing 31 separate expert reports from 26 international medical specialists. The CCRC publicly confirmed in February 2026 that its review remained ongoing, stating clearly that determining guilt or innocence is not its role, and that its job is solely to assess whether new evidence creates a real possibility that a conviction would not be upheld if sent back to the Court of Appeal. In January 2026, the Crown Prosecution Service announced it would not pursue 11 further charges against Letby, relating to 9 additional babies, stating the evidential threshold required to bring new charges had not been met, while explicitly clarifying that this decision had no bearing on her existing convictions. Around the same time, coroners in England formally opened inquests into the deaths of 5 of the babies Letby had already been convicted of murdering, hearings that were subsequently adjourned and are expected to resume later in 2026. These inquests are not retrials and legally cannot overturn a criminal conviction. Their purpose is narrower, focused on formally recording the circumstances of each death, though a coroner's officer involved noted there remained reason to suspect an unnatural death in each case, language consistent with what the original criminal trial had already established. Separately, a wider public inquiry, led by Lady Justice Thirlwall, examining how hospital management and NHS oversight bodies responded to the internal warnings raised by doctors years before Letby's arrest, is expected to publish its findings later in 2026. Public interest in the case reached a renewed peak with the release of a Netflix documentary in February 2026, which reignited fierce and deeply divided public debate over whether Letby is guilty at all, a debate that, as of today, remains entirely unresolved by any court. As things currently stand, Lucy Letby's convictions remain fully in force, her whole life order remains in effect, and no court in the United Kingdom has overturned or altered a single one of her 15 convictions. She is reportedly regarded within her prison unit as a model prisoner, having taken on a role as her unit's librarian and reportedly having become close with another notorious inmate serving her own life sentence for killing a child. What makes her case fundamentally different from every other name on this list isn't a dispute over sentencing or a technicality in the paperwork. It's a genuine, ongoing, high-level disagreement involving actual medical and legal experts working through official government channels over whether the science used to convict her in the first place was ever solid enough to prove she committed these crimes at all. 10 women, spanning close to 2 centuries of British history, from a poisoner exploiting insurance policies in a Durham mining village to a nurse whose conviction is still being fought over in real time. Some killed for money, some for a twisted kind of love, and at least one simply for the thrill of it. But every single case on this list shares the same uncomfortable truth. The people meant to protect the most vulnerable among us, children, patients, family members who trusted them completely, were sometimes the very people who ended up destroying them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.